paper and then like, I don't want to have it recorded anymore, then we'll happily delete it for you.
Sure. It's kind of you.
Okay, so we are very happy to be hosting Peter King, who is a PhD student at the University of Bath. Have you defended yet, or?
No, my Viva was supposed to be in a couple of weeks, but there was some fun paperwork, and now it's at the end of August. But yeah, I've submitted, so I'm in that kind of weird void between done but not done.
Right. So he will be a postdoc at the University of Kent very soon, and he is going to talk to us about a willingness to pay for precautionary microplastics control. So please take it away, Peter.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to take questions, here, there, and everywhere. They don't have to be good questions. They don't have to be cutting questions. Absolutely anything I'm happy to talk about. So thanks to Carl and Stephen for, setting this up, and thanks everyone for taking some time out of your lunch. Before I go too much further ahead, I just wanted to say a big thank you to co-author. Well, this is my paper, but co-authors on the project. My supervisors at Bath, Alistair and Lucy, Stavros, Richard and Caroline, who've been instrumental in bringing insight from their kind of policy perspective, and the industry body as well. So the plan today is to go through these kind of three things, and really we're interested in this question about how does precaution as an attitude influence the willingness to pay for restrictions of a pollutant with uncertain effects. I'm going to break that down. I've got quite a while, so I can kind of go into that in more detail. Today, we're interested in microplastics. You may have heard of them a little bit. There's some attention on the marine plastic side. But what we're interested in is the microplastics, which don't have too much attention on them. Microplastics are plastics that are about 5 millimeters in diameter at their biggest. A lot of the time, they're an order of magnitude smaller than that. So really, you wouldn't say they're observable. Because they're so small, they have a lot of different kind of interesting properties, which I'll get onto. And the kind of justification for why we're looking at these pollutants, I'll show shortly. But essentially, there's some policy impetus that means we're interested in restricting these microplastics. And this work, we look at the willingness to pay to do that. So I'll kind of go through why I think we need to measure this in willingness to pay, how we measure it in willingness to pay, and then a little bit later on, I'll go through why I think it's worthwhile looking at the influence of precautionary attitudes on that willingness to pay and how that then affects restrictions. Just to restate what we got here, we find that people's latent precautionary attitudes, how precautionary each respondent feels about microplastics, we find that does significantly and substantially influence willingness to pay. Why that is important is because it shows that the benefits to doing precautionary restrictions might be higher if we account for this. And it also is relatively novel work in that a lot of the time in environmental economics, you won't find too much empirically on precaution. There are some studies which look at precautionary behavior, such as wearing seatbelts or stuff like this, but not so much on the willingness to pay side. So if that's just kind of a high-level summary, if you have to go and get lunch, that's all you need to take away. Willingness to pay for microplastics reductions is significantly influenced by precaution. But I can go into more detail about any and all of this. So 2019, the European Chemicals Agency, which is called ECHA, they released a report, and it's about 300 pages long. And essentially, they argue for a restriction on intentionally added microplastics. So, as I said before, microplastics are very, very small plastics. A lot of microplastics are just bigger plastics that have broken down. If you have a bottle and then you degrade it and degrade it and degrade it, eventually it's going to become microplastic. But in this case, what they're interested in is plastics that are deliberately designed to be this small. They use intentionally added to signify that these plastics are quite literally added intentionally to products. A good example is, say, cosmetics. You might put some microplastic in your toothpaste, sun cream, deodorant, and the function of it is to transfer one thing to another. So, it might transfer dirt off your face, or it might transfer paint to a wall. So there is clearly an economic value to using these microplastics, but there's an increasing kind of warning sign from the literature, biophysical, that there may be some health effects of using these microplastics. And I'll go through the kind of scientific evidence. I'll keep it high level and kind of brief. We don't want to get bogged down in that, but I will go through the kind of key findings on the effects of microplastics and why there's a kind of justification for banning them or restricting their use. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the science on why we're interested in microplastics, why they could be banned, where they're used, why they're used, and what can we do. And then I will establish why we're interested in willingness to pay and how that can, measure the value of benefits, and then what modeling we do. And I've just got, again, a nice quick summary there. So there's a lot of attention in the toxicology or environmental chemistry literature on microplastics now, and more generally on micropollutants, and some increasingly on microplastics. But despite the increased attention, I wouldn't say there's greater clarity. In fact, if you had to, quickly summarize the literature, what you would say is that the effects on humans are uncertain. I've got two studies here, just opposite ends really, and Dewey and Coors, and there's quite a few supporting papers since. What they did is show that actually there's no clear transmission mechanism, there's no clear health effects of humans ingesting microplastics. So we know that marine life might ingest microplastics. We've seen fish, seabirds, different small creatures. We know that ingests microplastics. And there's evidence now that humans ingest microplastics. There's a later paper down there I've cited by Coleman's, which finds microplastics in drinking water and bottled water, bottled beer, this type of thing. Seafood is another common mechanism. And what this means is that we know humans ingest microplastics, but we don't know what the health effects are. Now, that could be that these particles are too small and we can't analyze them effectively. That's true for nanoplastics, the next kind of order of magnitude down, but not necessarily for microplastics. It could be that the concentration is too low. Maybe there's just not enough microplastics out there to cause a problem for now. But again, how long does that concentration persist? Or it could be there is no effect, or there's not enough studies. So what we do is we just assume that the effects are uncertain. This has happened not so many times. A lot of the times in environmental economics, we deal with a pollutant with much more certain effects. If you're thinking carbon, there's so many papers now looking at the effects of air pollution. If you think about other water pollutants, even things like DDT or PCB, plenty of evidence on their toxicity. But in the microplastics case, which is relatively novel, we have this uncertainty. So we really can't say too much about the health effects. They could be worse in future, absolutely. But right now, we don't think they're as bad as possible. Just before I move on to the economic literature, what I wanted to do was touch on this final bit, irreversibility. So I mentioned already that because they're so small, when you release microplastics, and that could literally be abrasion of tires releases microplastics to the air, and eventually that gets to the ocean, or it could be rinsing off cosmetics down the drain, through to wastewater, through to the ocean. There's a lot of different mechanisms, but once you release these microplastics, it's actually very, very difficult to recover them. For the purpose of this, we can assume that it's irreversibly released, and I would say practically unrecoverable, at least not cost effective. Some chemists I've gone back and forth with on this, maybe there's some technology that can get towards that, But for the purpose of this work, we assume these two properties at the bottom. Uncertain effects, irreversible release. And what that kind of militates towards is this precautionary aspect of things. And I will come back to what I mean by the precautionary principle and why that comes up. So we have a proposed restriction which says these pollutants are irreversibly released and the concentration is increasing. However, the current effects are uncertain, but they may be worse in future. However, a lot of economics may deal with ex post analysis. Might say, what was the causal effect of this restriction? But at this point, we're much earlier in the kind of life cycle of that policy, and we can't look at effectiveness. We have to say, what is the value of doing this? The costs of doing a restriction, which would mean, stopping manufacturers from intentionally adding microplastics, that's been estimated with some certainty, depends on sectors, but there's some information on costs. But on the benefits side, there is very, very little, and I would probably go as far as to say zero, to the best of my knowledge, estimate of the benefits of reducing microplastics. Now, this problem of not having any information on the benefits has been tackled before. I've got a few interesting studies here that have looked at different pollutants and try to estimate the benefits of reducing those in willingness to pay terms. That first paper by Ivana Loger and Roy Brower looked at a very similar kind of setup, but they were interested in micropollutants with a much kind of greater level of certain effects. And what they found is that respondents were willing to pay to reduce the health risk from micropollutants. And then you could say the benefit of reducing this risk by whatever means it is this willingness to pay. So that's the kind of structure we're looking at. A lot of time people say, is there no revealed preference method we could use? Is there no market prices? I'm happy to take suggestions if you can think of one, but I really wasn't able to think where a market price applies for the kind of non-use marine environment context. And that's okay. There's a lot of different methods on using stated preferences, and there's a wide history of using that. And in fact, there's two papers I just wanted to talk about. So Michaela Faccioli is a postdoc at Exeter, and she did a study using hybrid models. And I will get onto the hybrid models later. That's kind of the methodological angle of the talk. And I'll touch on that later about why these models are appropriate to tease out the effect of precaution and willingness to pay. But in their work, they've teased out the effect of environmental attitudes on willingness to pay for some different pollution. Finally, just on the literature review side of things, I just wanted to touch on Tino Bates' paper. I spoke to him last week, and he did a really interesting paper in ecological economics last year. And again, it uses this hybrid choice model to investigate what determines the willingness to pay to restrict a pollutant. In their case, they say, what is the willingness to pay to restrict marine plastics more generally? As I said, we look at microplastics as a specific instance of that. And we changed the country, changed the method. But this type of method has been used before. There's a strong literature on this, good background. So we're not changing anything in terms of the method. It's the analysis and the kind of pollutant that we look at that's different. Just kind of restating a few kind of key things here. There's a proposed restriction. No benefits have been estimated. We estimate the benefits in willingness to pay terms. Not appropriate or not relevant market prices available. And we use the two most common stated preference methods. Today, I'm going to talk about the contingent valuation. I know this method, a lot of people are skeptical of it or cast doubt on the validity, but I can present a lot of validity checks and talk about the design and all of this. We also do a choice experiment. I'm not talking too much about that today. I did last week at the ERIE conference, but I'm more than happy to discuss why we do that, how we do that, what we get from that. But it's also available as a working paper. Okay, so we're interested in estimating willingness to pay. Common approach is to use a survey. We had some funding from the Environment Agency to do this, and we employed a survey company and eventually got 670 respondents. Before getting to that stage, there was a lot of pre-testing that involved discussing with the experts. So I spoke to toxicologists, chemists, specialists, risk managers, economists, ecologists, all types of people, industry specialists. And the goal was to understand what are the effects of microplastics, how do we communicate this to respondents, how do we design a survey which gets a useful value out. So there's a lot of work done for the survey to establish, the kind of information validity and the content validity. It's very common to do this pre-testing process. We end up with 670 respondents. What I do today is present the results on the most valid part of that sample I can get. Now, sample truncation is a very controversial area in kind of survey methods. I do run the survey with the full sample. I can run it with subsamples. I can run it with any type of sample, and I got those results. I don't think it changes the conclusions too much to use a truncated sample. And my reason for doing this is to try and get at the most valid responses. Because a lot of kind of economists have doubts about the stated preference methods, especially about contingent valuation, and that's totally understandable. So we try and get ahead of that and just preserve the most, valid people using a few different rules. And again, there's a strong kind of empirical and theoretical background for any of these tests. But I mean, I'm happy to talk about validity some more, and I'm happy to talk about full sample results. Okay, so you could do a state preference survey, you could get your 304 respondents, and you could get that data. Now, the most common approach to dealing with that is, a very standard, very simple probit model. You could, regress the observation, the 0, 1 on, the bid level and the respondent characteristics, and that would get you a willingness to pay value, but not a whole lot else. And what we do in this work is exploit this novel kind of integrated choice latent variable model. It's just a hybrid choice model. Most often you'll see it called a hybrid choice model in the discrete choice literature. And what we do this for, and I'll go into more detail about this. The reason we do this is we're interested in the effect of latent respondent level attitudes on willingness to pay. So previously, what happened in the literature is people would say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how terrified do you feel about this pollutant? Or how much do you like the environment? Or some scale. And they would include those levels in the right-hand side of some probit regression and just say, hey, here is the effect of 1 level increase in attitudes on willingness to pay or likelihood of choosing an option. However, that approach can introduce some measurement error. Stefan Hess has done a huge amount of work in this area, just trying to show that, we only have indicators of attitudes, so there's going to be some measurement error already there. We don't perfectly observe attitudes, so we don't really want to use that, potential measurement error in a normal standard regression. And also another kind of aspect of this is, what happens if utility and attitudes? What happens if they're endogenously determined? So I'll get more onto what I mean by all of this critique, but essentially in this work, we use both the normal standard approach of estimating willingness to pay, and then we compare it with this hybrid choice approach, which should be a more appropriate, more theoretically kind of correct, I suppose, method of estimating the effects attitudes on willingness to pay. Yeah, so just going through here. Normally, we don't observe utility, we just observe the choices. We have indicators. I'll go through these 3 different indicators we have. These are just Likert scales, and I'll show them in the next slide. And they are indicated by the attitudes. Now, I just want to use the word latent. We don't observe attitudes, we only observe indicators, so possibility of measurement error. We have some socioeconomic data, things about age, gender, distance, income, all of this, and I can talk through that later. And we also have some detail on the choice itself. That's just a kind of diagram. Moshe Ben-Akiva has done a huge work on different hybrid choice specifications, and I will show the equations shortly. So the most kind of normal, standard, common model is just some indirect utility model. I haven't specified it here, but we can do that. And it just says, the choices of the respondent are determined by their taste parameters. That's very common. Some socioeconomic characteristics. Again, we observe these. And what I do here is just this latent variable alpha. Instead of putting in the indicators, as a linear kind of covariate, we have a different model for that. It's commonly called a structural equation. That's just a function of the indicators. And we can also link the indicators using a measurement equation. I won't get too bogged down in this, but I can show the results, and then I can kind of show the intuition a little bit more. This is the 3 questions we use. Some work will use previous scales. If we were doing something to do with place identity or pro-environmental behavior, there's a lot of previous scales we could adopt to use that. But because we're looking at this novel problem with microplastics and precautionary attitudes, which I don't believe has been observed before in the literature, we design our own 3 Likert scales. Likert scales are very common. We use 5 levels. You could do 7, 9, 3, whatever. But this just made most sense out of the pre-testing. Is also consistent with a lot of the literature. And there's 3 very different questions. So this is threats to oneself, threats to yourself in the future. So getting at the precautionary aspect. And this question 15, and I sometimes refer to them as question 13, 14, 15, looks at threats to the environment. So we'll include these later, and this kind of motivation for hybrid choice model. The sample was broadly representative. We had a survey company, so we could get it pretty representative on a range of different measures. I will just take a drink now, but we have so what we do is use 2 contingent valuation questions. And then when we have that data, we analyze it using both the probit, very, very common approach, and the newer hybrid choice approach. And I can be able to show, differences between these specifications and what the effect of using this different specification is. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have these twin properties of uncertainty and irreversibility. And after much thought, what we do is we just ask respondents, what are you willing to pay to resolve these? So what I'm going to do is show the questions, discuss the willingness to pay from each one and how we modeled them. And then finally, I'll show how we can actually compare the 2, which is not often done in the literature. Normally, you would focus on one specific question. We can do that, but I think what's interesting is also the ratio of the 2 together. So you don't have to read all of that. 670 respondents did. But the key thing is this final line. So would your household, here we measure in per household per year terms, very common, makes it easier to aggregate the willingness to pay later. Be willing to pay X pounds. X is a random vector. We call that the bid level. And we do some pre-testing to determine what's an appropriate bid level. It's randomized, so we have, say, 100 respondents at one bid level, 50 at another, 30 at another, 200 at another. Actually, the numbers are wrong; they're all balanced. But we randomize that bid level. That's very common. In extra water bills, we found a huge amount of tax aversion. People were very, very averse to paying anything in tax. And actually, later you'll see that water bills make a lot more sense contextually. And specifically for some research. So here we just say caveats included, and obviously we try and stress to respondents how representative this can be. Some research that would resolve the uncertainty about microplastics. Now, we're all researchers here. We know that research just leads to more questions. But in the hypothetical scenario where this is possible, what would you be willing to pay for that? And I can tell you the respondents on the sample median willingness to pay was £53.30 per household per year in extra water bills for some research that definitively resolves the scientific uncertainty about the health effects of microplastics. Now, this is important because a lot of the time we don't know what the effects are of microplastics. As I said earlier, they're very, very uncertain. But here we can show actually, people are willing to pay to resolve this. A lot of pollutants that have been studied in literature already have this kind of research done. But we're quite novel. We can show actually there's a value to doing that research in itself. I just put at the bottom there the ordering. We randomized the order that people get questions. As I said, there were 2 contingent valuation questions. We can randomize that order. That's very common. Obviously, willingness to pay is sensitive to that, but actually it doesn't change the conclusions later on. So I've just blown up one of the kind of hybrid choice models here. And what we do is we just have some intercept level. That's very common. It's very, very negative. And huge heterogeneity in that. We have the bid level. So I say bid, here it's this X. And that's very negative. That's absolutely standard intuition. The higher the bid level, the less likely someone is to, vote for a scenario like this. But what's interesting is this lambda parameter. And that, in this case, represents the effect of latent precautionary attitudes on the likelihood of someone choosing the scenario. So here we say, would your household be willing to pay? And we just say respondents, yes or no. That's all it is. They can vote yes, they can vote no. Here we say the effect of higher precautionary attitudes is a large effect, a positive effect, and a statistically significant effect on the likelihood to vote for further research. What that means is that the more concerned respondents are with microplastics, the more likely they are to support research into it, and also their willingness to pay is higher. I've got some covariates here, and these are just covariates not of the choice model, but actually of this lambda. So we can say that someone watching the blue planet, they're statistically significant, is more likely to have a precautionary attitude, or their precautionary attitudes are higher. And finally, I've just got the 3 indicators here. So these refer to question 13, 14, 15. And you can see the effect on the latent attitude, very significant, very strong. So that's the first contingent valuation question. And what I show is that the hybrid choice model can show us how do these latent precautionary attitudes, which we observe or observe the indicators of, how do they affect the willingness to pay, and how do they affect the likelihood of choosing this scenario? What I'll do now is show the second valuation question we used. It's the second in this presentation, but to some respondents it was the first because we randomized it. And the setup is very similar. Would your household, again, same terms per household per year, be willing to pay X pounds? This is the bid level. As far as I'm aware, we use exactly the same bid levels. So there's no difference in scale or anything like that. Extra water bills, again, just for comparison and also validity, to implement this policy. And in this case, the policy is here. So what we do is we say, assume there was some technology that could upgrade wastewater treatment, and that would stop microplastics going to the ocean. Now, that's not as far-fetched as you might think. There's actually very good filtration systems at the moment, but they just require, a little bit of specificity, or some plants have to be retrofitted. So there's actually, this scenario is actually not as unrealistic as some people think. It's actually, pretty plausible. And what we say is, if you use microplastics in paints, tires, detergents, cosmetics, sun cream, whatever, that eventually will go into wastewater. And then a lot of microplastics just flow straight through those into the marine environment. But this policy would say that, hypothetically, you would upgrade these wastewater treatment plants, and they would reduce all microplastics going to the environment. And therefore, we stop that irreversible release of microplastics. So remember earlier I talked about the uncertain effects in the irreversible release. One question of our survey looks at resolving uncertainty. This question looks at resolving irreversibility. Now, what's interesting here is this medium willingness to pay. If you recall from 2 slides ago, resolve uncertainty, £53. Resolve irreversible release, 73. I don't want to get bogged down in the precise magnitude of the willingness to pay at this point. Later, I can do some cost-benefit analysis, some aggregation, some policy kind of impact analysis, and show that, or show the comparison to costs. But right now, what I'm interested in is not the magnitude per se, but the ratio of the two. And what I mean by that is the willingness to pay for this scenario is much higher. And I can go later and show you that finding of a preference for precautionary restrictions to resolve irreversibility. That finding is robust to every sample truncation I could think of. It's robust to ordering. It's robust to econometric approach. Absolutely everything you can think of. But to carry on with the hybrid choice theme, we again show the same results. So negative intercept. The bid level is very significantly negative. That's very common. Again, latent precautionary attitudes have a very strong positive, statistically significant effect on the likelihood of choosing this scenario. So the intuition here is that someone who's reports they're very concerned about the current and future effects of microplastics on themselves and the environment, someone who answers 5 out of 5 on the Likert scales, that respondent is much more likely to vote yes to this scenario, and then also be willing to pay more for this scenario. Broadly similar here, and I think actually I can compare and contrast. The lambda, pretty consistent. Age, no effects. Gender, no effects. No distance decay. That's possibly due to microplastics being so small you can't really see them if you went to the ocean or something like this. Income effects, we don't find any income effects. That's robust to measuring in levels or measuring as a dummy or whatever I do to it. We never find any income effects. We do find a blue planet effect. So if you are aware, there's a BBC TV program, and it just did 1 episode on marine plastics, and I think actually kind of comes up in a few more episodes. But essentially, it's an environmental program about the marine environment, and people who saw that have stronger precautionary attitudes, and then we can show here that that actually feeds through later to their choices and their willingness to pay. Just to kind of show off how much coding I can do in R, I've thrown a million calculations here. So willingness to pay is sensitive to a lot of stuff. You can change the sample, you can change the model, you can change the econometric approach. It is sensitive to that. But what's important is the conclusions don't change. They're robust to this. The conclusion that question 7 willingness to pay is higher, that holds. The conclusion that respondents are willing to pay for these different policies, that holds. And actually later when I do cost benefit analysis, it doesn't change any conclusions on that side. Just conscious of time somewhat, I've copied a graph here from a Bates 2020 ecological economics paper. And what I wanted to show was the different impact of latent attitudes on different questions. So if you recall here, question 6, not really a huge effect. Actually, the effect is larger for question 7. That doesn't really hold over the graph though. So I've just fitted some willingness to pay at different levels of the latent attitude. And you can see people who are very strongly precautionary, this one, their mean willingness to pay is much higher than those at the lowest. That doesn't really hold for the question 7. That doesn't really make too much of a difference. So it could be that respondents who are more precautionary increase their willingness to pay or for research much more than that for question 7. So it could be that resolving irreversibility is not as sensitive to latent precautionary attitudes. It's just nice to have a graph which shows fitted willingness to pay at different levels. So 20 minutes to go. What I've done here, and actually somewhere else, I have a much bigger, crazier graph. And what I've done is just take estimated willingness to pay from the 2 questions, subtracted the difference per respondent for the different scenarios, and then just graphed the histogram of that. So using the standard probit approach, I've got single band dichotomous choice here, just because that's what we call this kind of approach in the contingent valuation literature. But in the probit approach, you estimate 1 willingness to pay for question 6, 1 for question 7. We take the difference, and maybe 2 peaks, but around that £20 mark. And actually, there's not a huge amount of variance. But this is what I was saying about the specification. Yes, willingness to pay is sensitive to specification, but does it change the conclusion that there's some kind of premium for precautionary restrictions? No. Now, using the hybrid choice model that I've been showing here, actually that variance substantially increases. We get a huge amount more differences. Again, I don't know if you can, there's a few people where it's lower. That might be an error in typing. But essentially what we find is that there's a huge variance in latent attitudes across the sample. That makes sense. You know, we measure in the individual level. A lot of people have very different beliefs, and that affects this variance in the premium. Here I've just called it a precautionary premium. I just wanted to touch on that. I call it a precautionary premium because it's an increase in, or it's a kind of premium on your willingness to pay for some restriction that's precautionary in nature. You know, we resolve irreversibility despite potential uncertainty. That's quite a common setup for the precautionary aspect of these things. But I'm happy to talk more about precaution in the literature, or you know what I mean by that. Just whilst I've got some time, I just wanted to test for it. Just note some caveats. The high truncation rate suggests we could have done a little bit more pre-testing, but I've already spoken about why I think that's necessary to preserve validity of the responses. But the conclusions do hold with the full sample. We also did the data collection in April 2020, which is a somewhat eventful month. So there may be some, you know, coronavirus effect. We have a question in there on has your income been affected by the pandemic, yes or no? And what we find is that those people who were affected, they report slightly lower income. Attitudes are consistent between those who are and aren't affected, so we can say it's probably down to an income effect. And those people are willing to pay slightly less. Conclusions still hold. There's still precautionary premium. People are still willing to pay more to resolve irreversibility, but the magnitude of the willingness to pay is slightly lower, purely through an income effect. But if you resampled later, you might get some attitudinal changes as well. I think I do actually have time, but as I said, we did some cost-benefit analysis. Back of the envelope stuff, just trying to show, how does this compare to costs? The research scenario is very viable. Costs are not too crazy on that. But the wastewater treatment plant upgrades in question 7 to resolve irreversibility, that is sensitive to costs. It's a willingness to pay somewhat, but if the costs overran significantly, then it's possibly not viable. But with the best information we have, and with a range of different willingness to pay values, we think that's economically viable to do. I also got some information on information provision. We give respondents a lot of different information about what are microplastics, why should you care about them, why do we care about them, and that's pre-tested between 10, 15 different parties at some points. And I've got some data on how do respondents interpret that, what is their knowledge about that, and what's the effect on willingness to pay. I suppose a headline finding from that is that respondents who know more about microplastics are willing to pay more for research into them. Similarly to attitudes, the effect on the resolving irreversibility is not so large. So most of the effect of information is on question 6, not question 7. But there is still an effect, increasing willingness to pay. So with something like 10, 15 minutes to go, I will stop talking shortly. But essentially what we do is we investigate the value of a precautionary restriction. Precautionary because there's uncertain effects, but also irreversibly released. So any restriction would precautionarily restrict them in case the concentration and the effects are worse in future. We investigate the value to that. There's a policy reason for doing that. Benefits haven't been estimated before. We're consistent with a lot of the literature in the probit approach, but we also augment it with this hybrid choice approach to show that the effect of latent attitudes is to increase willingness to pay for precautionary restrictions. I hope that hasn't confused you too much. My email's down there. It's also p.m.king@kent.ac.uk if you wish. But I'm happy to take questions now. That can be absolutely anything I've covered, or happy to talk about future work or how my day is. But I hope that helps. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. Are there any questions for Peter? Yes, Stefania, go ahead.
Hi, Peter. Hi. My question is, so when you so you have these two options. So as if I understood correctly, so the one is about spending for research to understand whether this microplastic have any negative effects. But then when you think about the benefits of this option with respect to the other, the benefits it's just that the knowledge of the truth, but what if then you do find that there is some negative effects? So I don't know, how do you what is that you do in this when you compare them in terms of outcomes?
Sure. No, it's a good question. And I think a lot of the time, I know I've done an okay job presenting if someone comes up with this question. So what we say is that one of the problems is we don't know the effect. And then we just say, you could pay this much in this policy to resolve that uncertainty. And of course, resolving uncertainty could go the other way. It could say, these are absolutely harmless. We don't need to worry about this. But another feasible outcome of that is that you would have to do question 7. You would have to do some policy afterwards. We don't spell that out to respondents. So whether they kind of come to that conclusion themselves, I don't know. We present them as substitutes. We say this is one option, this is another, based at the same point. But you're totally right. In reality, you would probably say, okay, we've now done the research. What is the value of treating that afterwards? I think you'd probably have to change the text somewhat to get at contingent on the outcome. What are you willing to pay for the treatment?
Yeah, I guess they are internalizing this aspect when they think they were willing to pay less. If they're then thinking, well, then if we do find something, then some extra money will. So I'm just trying to see how that can also partly explain the difference. They're not directly comparable in terms of the outcome benefits to the
to the respondent, I suppose. I suppose if you're an average person walking the street, the benefit of you knowing that microplastics are a problem is not so much. But I guess what it gets at is that, one, as you say, people internalize this expectation. If there is some research that shows, well, I suppose we can look at it the two ways, right? If the uncertainty shows there's no problem, I have that peace of mind. And I know a lot of people would be willing to pay. Phew, that's a relief. I'm glad they're not a problem. And the other side of it is, well, if it is a problem, and if we have this irreversibility problem as well, where you can't recover them, they're being released to the environment, you can't recover them, and the concentration is increasing, it could be that it's almost a foregone conclusion. You might not guess when this is going to be a problem, but it could be a problem in future. So it may just be respondents have already internalized that as you suggest. It's a really interesting kind of area, and I've gone back and forth, on the appropriate interpretation of that question, of the difference between the two, and I think that answers your question. But no, thanks for highlighting it. I like that internalization explanation.
So on the issue of research, to figure out whether these do pose a threat to human health, it sort of reminds me of these studies in psychology where they find people who, for example, could find out, say, for free whether they are at risk for cancer due to their genetics, and they decide, no, I don't want to find out. So there's a lot of people. It doesn't make sense from a really utilitarian perspective, but don't want to find out information that would sort of tell them that the state of the world is
ignorance is bliss, right?
Right. And I was just wondering if there might be any of that going on in this setting.
Could be. We don't explicitly ask on that. What we do have is a few different things. One is we have their attitudes. So we know that people who are more concerned are willing to pay more. So that suggests that people who, they're terribly concerned, but they don't want to know anything, can't really detect it. What else do we have? We have information on how much do people know about microplastics. There are some people who say, 0 out of 5, I don't know anything about microplastics. And those people are not willing to pay so much for research, similarly to people who have low attitudes. So yeah, it could certainly be that. I remember with this scenario, we have a lot of protests. We have people saying, I don't want to pay for research. I don't think my money should be used like this. Which, comes across very often in this type of work.
Right.
And we also have a lot of people saying no. I think, if we have, say, 670, something like 350 say yes, 250 or whatever the complement is, that is, say no. So it's actually very balanced how many people are willing to pay for research. And yeah, I would definitely guess that some of that is due to, not wanting to know, not believing it's an issue. Could well be due to that. Let's write some of this down as well. Yeah. Any more, really? You got 5 minutes. It can be absolutely any question on anything. I just start my postdoc. You could ask about that.
Perhaps I'm curious to know what your other study, how it complements this one. I mean, very
Sure.
briefly, as you mentioned, you address the similar questions.
Sure.
So,
no, it's a good question. Yeah. So it's the same survey, and what we do is we say, these contingent valuation questions are, they're pretty general. Resolve uncertainty, resolve irreversibility. That's a pretty general way of doing things. In the choice experiment, which comes after these questions in the survey, we say, now let's look at a specific instance of that restriction. So kind of explanation is, ECHA would restrict microplastics. That means that manufacturers can no longer use them in their products, and substitutes are available, silica, different materials. But those are not so good. They have to do some work reformulating products. And what we do is, using a choice experiment, which has a whole different kind of field. We can talk about design and all of that. We just say, how do respondents trade off different product attributes when no longer using microplastics? So if these questions are very general, just saying, broadly about a restriction, what are you willing to pay? That choice experiment is more concerned with, specifically, in this restriction, cosmetic products would become more expensive, possibly become less effective, but they would use fewer microplastics. And we just look at, what do people choose? What's the marginal willingness to pay? Do people care about all these attributes? And actually, how this work came about is, we were interested in the effect of latent precautionary attitudes on their choices in the choice experiment. The hybrid choice model is much, much more common in the discrete choice literature. So I'd already estimated it for the choice experiment. The findings are slightly less clear cut on that. We find that, again, there is an effect of precautionary choices, and the effect is pretty small in that case, mainly because we're dealing with, marginal willingness to pay, which is very, very small. And we show that respondents who are more precautionary are more willing to trade off cosmetic attributes. So what that means, really, from the point of view of the policy, is that we can go back and say, look, people are willing to pay for the fact you're doing a policy now rather than later. They're willing to, and they're also specifically willing to pay for this changing cosmetics. You could have used different products. You could use paints, tires, detergents, whatever. Cosmetics made the most sense. There's some restrictions on that already. Very easy to communicate to respondents. But yeah, again, we find that precautionary attitudes change or influence people's behaviour and willingness to pay. Well, I finally got around to including it. It's sometimes frustrating, you present half the work and you think, oh, there's loads left. But thanks for picking that up. I'd like to talk about that.
Okay. If there aren't any more questions, then I think we can thank Peter for presenting with us today. I'll give him a very isolated round of applause. And yeah, thanks everyone for showing up this afternoon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
And have a great day, Peter, and everyone else.
Cheers. Thank you very much. No, thanks.